Let's talk a little more concerning dual agency. In situations where a broker functions as a dual agent, typically occurring during a cross-sale involving two licensees within one brokerage, both agents assume the role of dual agents. This implies that both agents treat each client, whether a seller or a buyer, with equal consideration. However, the practical reality of such a scenario raises concerns for every broker. The initial challenge lies in ensuring proper disclosure to clients before any contracts are drafted, especially on the last page of the purchase contract. The AAR Residential Purchase Contract's last page incorporates two sections for agency disclosure, one for the buyer and another for the seller. Despite a company's policy and procedure manual specifying the necessity for both agents to indicate both buyer and seller for their agency relationship, discrepancies may occur. The broker is then faced with the dilemma of whether to have clients redo the last page of the contract, make amendments, or create an addendum clarifying the representation of both parties. Interestingly, a listing brokerage has the option to reject dual agency. For instance, during an open house, if a buyer expresses interest in purchasing the property, the listing agent may, with full disclosure, reject dual agency and state to the buyer that they have exclusively representing the seller only. This involves inviting the buyer to discuss and select their agency preference. The buyer must then acknowledge the representation arrangement or reject it in favor of seeking representation elsewhere. If the buyer rejects the exclusive representation by the listing agent, the options include offering dual agency, if permitted by the broker and chosen by the seller, or advising the buyer to find another licensee for representation outside the listing brokerage. Despite potential reluctance to pay a co-broke commission, this option may be necessary if the buyer insists on representation and the seller does not want dual agency. In scenarios where the listing agent exclusively represents the seller, additional steps are required. The buyer is asked to complete and sign the READ form, confirming the seller-only representation. The agent, while assisting the buyer with various aspects, remains a representative of the seller. The completion of both broker sections on the AAR residential contract, checking seller exclusively, reinforces the understanding that the buyer lacks representation in the transaction. Balancing the delicate act of working for the seller while working with the buyer ensures the seller's protection, even with the extra workload. When working with a buyer without representation, the agent follows specific guidelines. They write the contract based on the buyer's instructions, provide minimal assistance without delving into pricing or terms discussions. They may help find a lender without discussing programs or terms. The agent may assist in locating an inspector, although it is always the best practice to not refer any company anymore. Even if you gave them 3 choices to select from and look at the companies themselves, it may often come back to you if something goes wrong. The agent may also guide the buyer through timelines without offering specific advice. The agent's role extends to participating in property-related visits, including inspections, appraisals, and walkthroughs. The buyer is informed of their ability to send a cure notice if the seller breaches, aligning with the agent's fiduciary duty to the seller while maintaining fairness and honesty with all parties involved. These actions should adhere to the broker's policy and procedure manual, outlining the agent's obligations in such situations. There are 3 primary types of agency offered by companies and their agents, typically governed by state legislation, regulatory rules, or state constitutions. These 3 types are brokerage agency. In this type of agency, authority originates from the designated broker, DB, or the equivalent responsible party designated by the state. In Arizona, the Arizona Department of Real Estate, ADRE, mandates that every entity has a DB who is responsible for the brokerage's operations and compliance with state regulations. Agency and brokerage begins with the DB, and if 2 licensees, both under the same DB, handle a transaction, one as the listing agent and the other as the buyer's agent, it is considered dual agency. This isn't merely a broker's policy. Rather, it is a regulatory requirement from ADRA outlining how agency functions in Arizona. office agency. This type involves a DB-like figure at the office level, acting as the responsible party. In states embracing office agency, two agents within the same office would be dual agents. However, if the buyer's agent is located in a different office from the listing agent, it does not constitute dual agency. Despite this model being operational in about a dozen states, Arizona does not permit office agency. Don't be confused here. Say you are an agent for brokerage ABC. ABC has 12 offices all under the sale employing broker. They are just offices headed by a designated broker. If you find a listing with someone from another office like this, it would be dual agency. If, however, you are working with a franchised broker, LMNO, and each office is independently owner and operated, even though it has the same name, that is not considered dual agency. Each office may be LMNO of the East Valley or Arizona LMNO Luxury Homes. Single agency. In the single agency model, agency relationships start and end with the individual agent. Selling your own listing falls under dual agency, while any other transaction does not. While some states adopt this approach, Arizona does not permit single agency. Note that if you own the home, you cannot represent the buyer at all. What forms do you use for what agency representation? The Real Estate Agency Disclosure and Election, READ, form. Buyer-Broker Exclusive Employment Agreement, BBEEA. Consent to Limited Representation, CLDR. Disclosure of buyer agency and seller waiver and confirmation. The Buyer-Broker Exclusive Employment Agreement is just that. Both parties, the buyer and the buyer's agent, are bound by their respective obligations in the bilateral contractual arrangement. Utilize this form when seeking an exclusive relationship with a prospective buyer before presenting any properties. This document establishes a binding, two-way exclusive agreement, often entailing the buyer's payment of a retainer fee and/or commission. It should be signed during the initial discussion of agency with the buyer, and its usage requires the explicit knowledge and approval of your broker. In Arizona, the adoption of the Buyer-Broker Agreement, BBEA, is not widespread. Although its prevalence is growing as more agents recognize its benefits, many remain hesitant to implement it. Critics argue that, since numerous agents do not insist on buyer signatures, clients may resist and opt to collaborate with agents who do not impose such requirements. The BBEEA indeed forms a binding, two-way commitment, similar to a listing agreement, but its adoption lacks widespread endorsement. Some brokers, especially those in commercial industrial real estate, mandate its use for all agents, while others prohibit its utilization due to agents' insufficient training on the contractual obligations it imposes. Ultimately, the decision to employ the BBE rests with the individual agent, supported by the broker's commitment to endorsing it and providing necessary training for agents choosing to implement it. Similarly, the Buyer-Broker Agreement imposes obligations on both parties involved. In particular, the compensation section of the agreement empowers the licensee to request compensation from the buyer if the buyer acquires any property during the agreement's term. However, this obligation is waived if the licensee receives compensation from the seller or listing agent that matches the agreed-upon compensation in the agreement. For instance, if the agreement stipulates a $17,000 commission at the close of escrow, the buyer is exempt from compensating the licensee if the licensee receives that amount or more from the seller or listing agent. Conversely, if the commission obtained from the sale is only $14,000, the buyer is liable for the $3,000 difference. This contractual provision is transparent to the buyer before making an offer, enabling them to structure their offer accordingly. The Buyer-Broker Agreement serves various purposes for the licensee. In a scenario involving a for sale by owner, FSBO property, where the licensee can show the property but is not guaranteed compensation, having the Buyer-Broker Agreement signed by the buyer allows the licensee to leave the decision to view the property up to the buyer, with the understanding that purchasing it would entail commission payment to the licensee if the seller does not agree to pay a commission to the agent for bringing a buyer. Moreover, The agreement establishes a binding relationship between the buyer and the licensee, reducing the likelihood of the buyer purchasing a property without their agent. In the event that a buyer does stray and make a purchase without involving the licensee, the agreement ensures that the licensee is entitled to the stipulated commission. Therefore, through appropriate counseling and guidance, buyers who sign the buyer-broker agreement are generally inclined to stay loyal to their agent, cognizant of the potential commission obligation. Note too that on this form, you should not be very explicit in what you are going to try and find for the buyer. Say that the buyer wants to purchase in Gilbert only. Do not write that on this form. If the buyer goes and purchases a home with another agent in Mesa, you may be out of luck in taking them to court to receive a commission. The Real Estate Agency Disclosure and Election, READ. This form explains to the buyer or seller what the agent's purpose or duties are to each separately, and if a dual agency comes up. Every brokerage will require this form, and it is a good idea to talk to your buyer or seller about the various options prior to going under a listing or purchase. Consent to Limited Representation, CLDR. This form is much like the READ, however it discloses the fact of dual agency, which we talked about previously. Disclosure of buyer agency and seller waiver and confirmation. Say the listing agent is in the hospital having a baby and will not be available for 24 hours. This form would be used then, and the buyer's agent would have to negotiate with the seller directly. This form is only used for a 24-hour period of time. If the seller wanted an agent to list the property on MLS but do all their own negotiating, then that verbiage would be put into the listing agreement.